He thought they were gone forever, his twin daughters lost to the world, vanished 3 years ago. But then, out of nowhere, he found them, on a bus, singing songs with the kind of joy he never thought he'd hear again. What he didn't know was that the truth waiting for him would shatter not just his heart, but his entire life before the story even began. Tell us where you're watching this video in the comments below. And if you love these kinds of stories, don't forget to subscribe. Now, sit back and let the story unfold. For 3 years, I had buried myself in silence, not just the kind you find in empty rooms, but a kind that seeps into your bones, into every breath you take. My days were measured by the sun burning over the ridge, the endless fence lines stretching like scars across my land, and the cold nights where the stars burned brighter than any hope left in me. I built these walls, not just of timber and stone, but of isolation and regret. No one came here unless they wanted to be found dead, and I was sure I'd never want to see another soul again. But the day they arrived, the silence was shattered. 6 figures knelt in the dust, their forms barely visible against the endless expanse of cracked earth and dead grass. Their clothes hung in tatters, stained and ripped, faces streaked with dirt and tears. I could see the youngest, barely more than a child, and the oldest, worn beyond her years. They begged for something I'd convinced myself I no longer had: mercy, refuge, salvation. I had no right to give it. For years I told myself the world was poison, and solitude was the only cure. I learned that helping others meant inviting pain into your life, pain I wasn't willing to bear again. But seeing them there, broken and desperate, something stirred deep inside me, a flicker of the man I once was, the man I swore I'd never be again. Their story came in ragged fragments, whispered in a voice that cracked with exhaustion and fear. They were running from hunters, a cruel, relentless force that saw them not as people but as property. Slavers, they called them. Men who traded in pain and blood, wielding power like a curse. I didn't want to be part of their fight. I wanted to turn away, to retreat back into my fortress of silence and forget this moment ever happened. But as the youngest faltered, blood seeping from her trembling fingers, I felt the walls I'd built around my heart begin to crumble. There was no running from this. I carried the weakest in my arms, feeling the fragile weight of life clinging to hers. And for the first time in years, the rifle in my hand felt like a shield, not a burden. The sound of hooves thundered in the distance. The hunters were close, their arrival inevitable. The choices before me were impossible. Turn them away, and I'd be signing their death warrant. Help them, and I'd make myself a target, a man marked by the ghosts of his past and the ruthless cruelty of those who stalked us. But standing there, in the blistering sun, I realized something I'd long forgotten. Sometimes survival isn't about hiding from the world, but standing up to protect what little light remains. The wind was a harsh mistress that day, carrying with it the grit of the desert and the taste of desperation. As I stepped down from the porch, my boots disturbed the cracked earth, sending small clouds of dust swirling around the feet of the 6 women kneeling in the dirt. Their eyes shunted and raw lifted toward me, silently pleading. It was a look I had long tried to forget, one that had once carved itself into my soul, but now it was back, unwelcome and persistent. I wasn't sure why they came to me. Maybe it was the remoteness of this place, a place where few dared to tread. Or maybe it was that isolation I had chosen for myself, which seemed to whisper safety even if it was just an illusion. For years, I had tried to build a fortress around my life, both physically and emotionally. This ranch was my sanctuary, a place where the noise of the world, the lies, the betrayals, the grief couldn't reach me. I believed I was safer this way, alone. But that day, safety was a fragile lie. One of the women, the one with fiery hair and eyes sharp enough to cut through the desert, raised her head first. Her voice was barely a breath when she spoke, and it broke something inside me. They were hunted, she said, by men who saw them as nothing but merchandise, pieces to be owned, traded, and discarded. The word slavers hung in the air like a curse. My heart clenched at the memory of promises broken and the price of cowardice I had paid years ago. I turned away, trying to silence the turmoil stirring inside me. I told them I couldn't help that the world was cruel and I was too broken to fight anymore. But their suffering was palpable. I saw the torn flesh beneath tattered cloth, the bruises hidden beneath dirt, the fear etched into every line of their faces. They were shadows of the lives stolen from them, and I could not deny the pull of something I had thought dead, a flicker of responsibility, maybe even hope. The youngest one faltered, blood darkening the dust beneath her. That was the moment the walls I had built began to crumble. I could feel the weight of the past pressing down on me, the wife I had lost, the promises I had broken, the man I had vowed never to be again. I carried her to my cabin, the fragile weight of her body reminding me painfully of the life I once tried and failed to save. The sounds of horses echoed across the valley. The hunters were near. My isolation had shielded me for years, but it offered no protection now. I could feel their presence closing in, relentless and cruel, as if the desert itself conspired against us. Inside the cabin, the air was thick with fear and fading strength. The women leaned on one another, finding what little strength they had left in their shared desperation. I moved mechanically, barricading doors and windows, preparing for a storm I had hoped never to face again. My hands trembled, not from fear, but from the weight of choices long deferred. I remembered the day she died, my wife. Her name was Sarah, and her screams haunted my nights. I had turned away then, choosing safety over courage. That choice had shattered me, and I vowed never to let it happen again. But standing there, facing down the shadows of my past and the monsters closing in, I wondered if redemption was still possible. The leader of the hunters was a man with a badge of federal marshal named Wade Garrett. His presence tainted everything. This was no simple band of raiders. Corruption ran deep, wrapped in law and authority, twisting justice into chains. Garrett was the devil wearing a crown of legitimacy, and his eyes held the cold calculation of a man who took what he wanted without remorse. The women's stories unfolded in pieces, contracts forged in lies, promises of freedom turned to cages, lives bought and sold like cattle. Their fear was a tangible thing, and it fueled my resolve. They were no longer just victims. They were survivors fighting for their last chance. I found myself standing on the porch, rifle in hand, heart pounding not with the fear of death, but with the fierce determination to protect. The sun beat down mercilessly, but it was nothing compared to the fire awakening inside me. The time for hiding was over. The first shot echoed across the valley, a thunderous roar that shattered the silence of my exile. The fight had begun. The blast of the rifle shot had shattered the desert's cruel silence, and for a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. My hands, though steady, trembled beneath the weight of what I had just done. The man who had haunted my nightmares, the man who wore his badge like a weapon, had fallen backward from the porch, his eyes wide with shock and disbelief. But the fight was far from over. His men reacted instantly, their guns erupting in a storm of bullets that shattered the wooden porch and tore into the earth around me. The cacophony of gunfire was unlike anything I had heard in 3 years, violent and relentless, a brutal reminder that the world I had tried to escape was now crashing through the walls of my sanctuary. I moved like a ghost, ducking behind the water trough, lever-action rifle cycling with practiced speed. Every shot was a measured promise to protect those broken women who had come to me in their darkest hour. They had found more weapons in the root cellar, and the women were no longer silent shadows but fierce defenders, rising from their exhaustion to stand alongside me. The youngest, the one with fever burning her fragile body, wielded a rifle with surprising strength, her blue eyes blazing with a determination that defied her weakness. The fiery-haired woman, who introduced herself as Clara, was already moving with a grim purpose, firing a shotgun with deadly precision. The battle was short, but brutal. One by one, the attackers fell or fled, their confidence shattered by the unexpected resistance. When the last rider galloped away into the fading light, a heavy silence settled over the ranch once more. But the victory was hollow. I knelt beside the fallen marshal's body, the man who had stolen everything from me, who had taken my Sarah, and who had come to claim these women as his property. He lay still, his eyes closed in death, but the ache in my chest remained. Years of guilt, shame, and regret crowded my mind memories I had tried to bury under the desert sun. Sarah had died calling my name, not in hope but in betrayal. I had failed her once, and now these women stood before me, survivors of a nightmare I was determined to end. But could I really protect them? Could I confront the darkness that had taken root in the very authorities meant to uphold justice? The women gathered in the cabin, their faces pale but resolute. Clara's hand was pressed firmly against her wound, her green eyes meeting mine with a fierce gratitude that was both humbling and terrifying. We were bound now, not by blood, but by shared pain and a fragile hope for freedom. We spoke little in the aftermath. Words were heavy with exhaustion, and the desert night pressed close, filled with whispers of the past and fears for the future. I thought of the life I had tried to forget, the man I had been before loss had broken me, and the man I hoped to become. The ranch, once a fortress of solitude, was now a battlefield and a refuge. Each creak of the cabin, each rustle of the night wind, reminded me that the peace I had sought was gone, replaced by a responsibility I had no choice but to accept. As dawn broke over the valley, the sun casting long shadows over the scarred earth, I knew the fight was only beginning. The corrupt marshal's death would not end the hunt. It would only ignite it. But for the first time in years, I was ready. Ready to face the ghosts of my past, to stand for those who could no longer stand for themselves, and to build a new kind of sanctuary, one forged in courage, sacrifice, and unyielding hope. The morning light did little to ease the weight settling on my chest. The ranch was scarred, battered, but standing like the women who'd sought refuge here. The battle had left its mark not just on the land, but deep inside me, awakening memories I thought were buried beneath years of silence and regret. I watched as the women moved quietly, their strength hard-won yet undeniable. They bore the marks of torment, bruises hidden beneath tattered clothes, haunted eyes that refused to look away from the horrors they'd endured. But beneath it all, I saw something that stoked a fire inside me. Unbroken spirit. Clara, the woman with the fiery hair and fierce gaze, was already tending to the youngest, the fragile one whose fever had flared during the night. The others gathered what little they could salvage, eyes always scanning the horizon, knowing that the hunters were not done with us yet. For 3 years I had chosen solitude to shield myself from pain. But now pain was a constant companion, mingling with determination and something I dared to call hope. I felt the ghosts of my past crowding in the memory of Sarah's screams. The night I fled, the weight of cowardice that had crushed me. But I would not be that man again. The men who had chased these women were more than slavers. They were puppets of a corruption so deep it poisoned the very law meant to protect. Wade Garrett, the marshal whose body still lay in the dust, was just one face of a monstrous system. Their reach was long, their cruelty unrelenting. I knew hiding wasn't an option. The valley might have offered sanctuary once, but it was no fortress against the evil hunting us. Every sound, every shifting shadow felt like the approach of those who wished us harm. So I made a choice. We would leave. I spent hours packing supplies into the battered wagon that had once carried my hopes and failures across this land. The women gathered around, weak but resolute, ready to step back into the nightmare they had fled because the promise of freedom was worth every risk. As dusk fell, we set out under a sky smeared with stars, the air thick with fear and fragile hope. Each mile we put between us and the ranch was a step away from the past, but the road ahead was fraught with danger. The desert was merciless, every sound magnified in the quiet night. We moved cautiously, hearts pounding with the knowledge that the hunters would not give up their prey easily. The weight of their pursuit pressed down on us, a constant reminder that freedom came at a price. During brief rests, I caught glimpses of the women's stories in their eyes, the strength forged in suffering, the silent promises made in the dark. Clara, who had carried herself like a warrior, showed moments of tenderness as she comforted the youngest. The others shared their own scars, each one a testament to survival against impossible odds. I thought of Sarah again, her face clear in my mind's eye. I whispered a vow to the desert wind, a promise to fight, to protect, to never run again. But the shadows lengthened. One night, as we camped beneath a skeletal tree, a distant howl cut through the stillness, a harbinger of the hunters closing in. Fear rippled through the group, but it was tempered by fierce resolve. We were fugitives, marked by scars both visible and hidden. We carried the burden of past betrayals and the fragile hope of a future free from chains. I looked around at these women, broken but unbowed, and realized that in protecting them, I was beginning to reclaim myself. The journey ahead was uncertain, the dangers many, but for the first time in years, I felt alive, and not just surviving, but fighting. The desert night was a cloak of silence, broken only by the crackling of a small fire and the shallow breaths of 6 weary women. Each one bore scars that told stories no words could fully capture, stories of pain, betrayal, and survival. They huddled close, trying to share what little warmth remained between them. I sat a few feet away, eyes fixed on the dark horizon where shadows seemed to move with malicious intent. The weight of responsibility pressed down like the relentless sun, burning away any illusion of the isolation I once clung to. It wasn't just about protecting these women anymore. It was about facing the demons I had fled from, the memories of loss, of guilt, and the man I used to be. Our escape from the ranch had been a desperate gamble. The narrow trail winding through the jagged rocks and dusty plains was fraught with danger, each mile a test of endurance. The wagon creaked under the weight of supplies, the wheels cutting through dry earth that threatened to swallow us whole. The women, though weakened by wounds and exhaustion, had rallied with a fierce determination that refused to be broken. Clara moved among them with a quiet strength, tending wounds and offering what comfort she could. I watched her, admiring the way she refused to let despair consume her. The youngest, her fevers still simmering beneath her fragile skin, rested against a bundle of blankets, her breathing shallow but steady. The others shared silent glances, communicating a resolve that no words could convey. In the distance, the faint clatter of hooves echoed like a heartbeat, growing louder with every passing moment. The hunters were relentless, merciless men who saw us as property, not people. They would not rest until they reclaimed their prey. I checked my rifle again, its weight familiar in my hands. The weapons we'd salvaged from the ranch were a lifeline. But against professional killers backed by corrupt lawmen, it felt like a fragile shield against an unforgiving storm. Every night, I lay awake beneath the vast expanse of stars, haunted by the faces of the women and the memory of Sarah. The promise I whispered to the desert, winds the vow to never run, again felt like a fragile thread holding together a tapestry of broken dreams and fragile hope. Days blurred together as we navigated the unforgiving terrain, our bodies pushed to their limits. The women's spirits faltered but never broke. Their courage was a beacon that lit the dark path ahead. I found myself drawn into their stories, each revelation a shard of pain and strength that reshaped the man I thought I'd lost. We spoke little of the past, but in quiet moments, the weight of unspoken truths filled the air. Clara's steady presence was a balm to fragile hearts, and I began to see her not just as a survivor, but as a symbol of the fight we all needed to face. One afternoon, as the sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the barren landscape, I spotted movement on a distant Regia scouting party, no doubt sent by the hunters to track our every step. The men moved with practiced stealth, their eyes cold and unyielding. The knowledge that we were being hunted brought a surge of adrenaline, but also a crushing fear. Each decision now carried the weight of life or death. The women's safety rested on choices made in moments too brief to think, but too important to get wrong. We found temporary refuge in a cave, nestled between rocky outcrops, a place where the wind whispered secrets and the sun's harsh gaze softened. Inside, the women collapsed onto the rough ground, their bodies drained, but their spirits still flickering with the flame of resistance. I tended the youngest's fevered brow, the heat radiating from her fragile frame a stark reminder of the stakes we faced. I couldn't let them down, not again. The cave offered a brief sanctuary, but the threat outside was unyielding. Night after night, the howls of distant dogs and the crackle of distant campfires reminded us that the hunters were closing in. Sleep was a fleeting visitor, replaced by restless vigilance and the constant hum of dread. But in the midst of fear, a fragile hope began to take root. The women shared whispered plans of a life beyond the deserted future, where their scars might heal and their stories might finally be written in freedom rather than chains. I listened, a quiet strength gathering within me. The man who had hidden from the world was beginning to rise from the ashes of his past, shaped by the courage of 6 women who refused to be broken. The road ahead was uncertain, the dangers many, and the shadows deep. But we would face them together, fugitives, survivors, and warriors bound by the unbreakable ties of hope. The sun had barely risen when we broke camp, the cold desert air biting at our skin as we loaded the wagon and prepared for another day on the run. Each movement was slow, deliberate. The wounds on their bodies were still raw, the exhaustion etched deep into every line of their faces. Yet in their eyes, I saw a fire that refused to be extinguished, a fire born from the cruel depths of the life they had escaped and the fragile hope of something better. We moved away from the cave, back into the open expanse of the desert, where the heat would soon bake the earth beneath our feet and the horizon seemed to stretch into infinity. The silence between us was thick, not just with fatigue, but with unspoken fears and memories too painful to voice. I kept watch at the front, rifle slung across my back, eyes scanning every ridge, every shadow. The past 3 years of isolation had sharpened my instincts, and though my muscles ached and my hands bore scars from the fight at the ranch, I was ready for what lay ahead. Clara walked beside me, her footsteps steady despite the weakness I knew she felt. The youngest, Grace, rode quietly on the wagon, her fever finally beginning to break, but still fragile. The others moved around her, a silent guard, protectors of their own kind. The desert was merciless, but it had also taught me one truth. Nothing here was as dangerous as the secrets people carried within themselves. And we were all carrying secrets, mine, buried deep beneath years of regret and silence. Our destination was a town 2 territories north, a place Clara had mentioned as a refuge for those who wanted to start over without the weight of the past dogging their every step. A schoolhouse, they said, needing teachers, people who wouldn't pry too deeply into where we came from. It was a dream on the horizon, a fragile thread pulling us forward. But the hunters were relentless. Every night, their presence felt closer, signs in the sand, whispers in the wind, and sometimes the distant crack of a rifle shot. They were closing in, and I knew that sooner or later, we would face them again. We stopped mid-afternoon behind a cluster of mesquite trees to rest and tend to wounds. Clara knelt beside Grace, wiping the sweat from her brow. The others moved quietly, gathering what little firewood they could find, their faces set in grim determination. I found a moment to speak, my voice low but steady, telling them about the road ahead, not just the physical miles, but the choices that would define us. I told them that the fight wasn't just for survival, but for dignity, for the right to live free from fear and chains. They listened, their eyes reflecting a flicker of hope, the first real light I'd seen since they'd arrived. As the sun dipped toward the horizon, painting the sky in hues of blood and gold, I made a decision. We couldn't keep running blindly. We needed allies, people who could help us take a stand. There was a man I had met years ago, before the exile, a root seller who traded herbs and remedies in the neighboring settlements. He was known for his wisdom and discretion, a man who could provide shelter, supplies, and perhaps a path to the outside world. It was a risk to reach out, but the alternative was to fade into dust, hunted and broken. That night, under a sky heavy with stars, I set out alone to find him, leaving Clara and the women in the safety of the mesquite grove. The desert was alive with sounds: the distant howl of coyotes, the rustle of dry leaves in the wind, and every step felt weighted with the burden of the choice I was making. When I found the root cellar, his face was lined with age and experience, his eyes sharp and wary. I told him our story in hushed tones, careful not to reveal more than necessary. He listened, his expression grave but not surprised. "The law won't help you," he said quietly. "Corruption runs deep, and those men who hunt you have friends in high places. But I know others who can't be bought or scared. You'll need more than rifles and courage if you want to survive." He offered supply herbs to heal wounds, food to sustain us, and a map marking safe routes and hidden refuges used by those like us, the hunted, the broken, and the brave. Returning to camp as dawn painted the desert in soft light, I shared what I had learned. The women's faces brightened with cautious hope. For the first time, the road ahead seemed navigable and not just a desperate flight, but a journey towards something more. Yet, the threat loomed large. Every passing hour was a countdown to confrontation, and we all knew the time was drawing near. The choices I'd run from for so long were back in front of me: fight or flee, trust or protect only myself. But I was no longer alone, and neither were they. Together we would face the coming storm. The days grew hotter, the desert sun relentless as it beat down upon us, draining the last of our strength. Each morning brought a new challenge: wounds reopening, spirits fraying, and the ever-looming threat of the hunters closing in. Every shadow could conceal an enemy. Every breeze carried the faintest whisper of pursuit. Our sanctuary was no longer a place, but a fragile thread stretched taut between hope and despair. Clara remained the anchor for us all. Even as her own wounds threatened to overwhelm her, she refused to let the darkness take hold. I watched as she moved through the camp, her presence a balm to those haunted by fear. Grace, the youngest, had begun to walk again, her steps tentative but determined. The others shared a quiet resolve, knowing that our survival depended on more than just hiding. It required strength, cunning, and a willingness to fight. One evening, as the sun sank below the horizon, painting the sky in fiery reds and purples, I sat alone on a rocky outcrop overlooking the valley. The wind whispered through the sagebrush, carrying with it memories I had long tried to bury. The weight of my past pressed down, heavier than the heat that radiated from the earth beneath me. I thought of Sarah, her laughter, her fierce spirit, and the moment I had failed her. Those memories had been my prison, chaining me to solitude and silence for 3 long years. But now, standing on the precipice of a battle, not just for my life, but for theirs, I realized that running was no longer an option. The root cellar's words echoed in my mind. Corruption runs deep. It wasn't just the hunters with their rifles and badges, it was the entire system built to oppress and silence those without power. To fight them meant more than weapons. It meant confronting a darkness that spread through the very foundations of the territories. Back at camp, the women prepared quietly. Weapons were cleaned and checked. Plans were whispered in the shadows. We were outnumbered, outgunned, but not outwilled. I could see it in their eyes, the flicker of hope, the spark of defiance that refused to be extinguished. As night fell, the first signs of the hunters appeared: faint glimmers of light, the distant crunch of hooves on hard ground. We held our breath, hearts pounding in unison. There was no turning back. The attack came swift and brutal. Shadows descended like vultures, rifles flashing in the moonlight. But we were ready. The women fought with a ferocity born from years of pain and desperation. Clara wielded her shotgun with deadly precision. Grace, despite her youth and frailty, held her ground with unwavering courage. I moved through the chaos like a man reborn, every shot fired, every breath taken a step toward redemption. The battle was a blur of noise and fury, of lives hanging by a thread. When the dust settled, silence reclaimed the desert. The hunters lay scattered, some dead, some fleeing into the night. But the cost was high. Wounds ran deep, and the ache of loss settled like a stone in my chest. As dawn broke, we gathered around the fire, bruised but unbroken. The women looked to me with a mixture of gratitude and determination. In their faces, I saw the reflection of the man I wanted to become, not the hermit haunted by guilt, but a protector, a fighter, a friend. The road ahead remained perilous, but for the first time in years, I felt something I had thought lost forever: hope. The desert silence after the battle was deceptive. The wounds we carried, both seen and unseen, reminded us that victory came at a steep price. I sat by the fire, tending to the youngest woman's fevered brow, the heat radiating off her skin, a cruel reminder of how fragile our hold on life still was. Grace's eyes fluttered open for a moment, a faint smile touching her lips before sleep reclaimed her. Clara was beside me, her own injuries slowing her but not diminishing her fierce spirit. She caught my gaze and nodded silently, an unspoken pact passing between us. No matter what came next, we would face it together. The others rested, the weight of exhaustion pressing down like a physical force. Each one carried a story etched in scars, and sorrow a past filled with stolen dreams and stolen freedom. But in that moment, beneath a blanket of stars, those stories became threads weaving us into something stronger, something unbreakable. Our respite was brief. News traveled fast through the territories. The hunt for us intensified. Wade Garrett's death had sent ripples through the shadowy networks of corruption, but it had not broken them. If anything, it had made the forces against us more ruthless. One evening, a figure appeared at the edge of our camp, a messenger, cloaked in dust and shadows. He brought news from the root cellar. Allies were gathering, others who had suffered under the same tyranny, willing to stand and fight for a chance at freedom. It was a fragile hope, but a hope nonetheless. We began to plan, to prepare for a confrontation that would decide not only our fate, but the fate of countless others trapped in chains of fear and silence. I found myself changing. The walls I had built around my heart were crumbling, replaced by a resolve forged in fire. The guilt that had haunted me for years was now a catalyst, pushing me forward rather than holding me back. Clara became more than just a companion. She was a beacon of strength. Together, we rallied the women, teaching them not just to survive, but to fight. Every day was a lesson in resilience, in courage, in reclaiming the power stolen from us. But with every step forward came the shadow of loss. We had to leave behind the safety of the valley, the remnants of my solitary refuge. The road was uncertain, fraught with danger, and yet it was the only path to freedom. As we moved toward the gathering point marked on the root cellar's map, the landscape changed. Small settlements, wary faces, whispered rumors. Each encounter was a reminder that the world beyond my ranch was vast and complex, filled with both peril and possibility. One night, under a blood-red moon, we reached the encampment, a motley assembly of outcasts, survivors, and fighters, united by a shared desire to end the reign of fear. Among them were men and women hardened by loss, their eyes reflecting the same pain and determination I had seen in Clara's. We were no longer alone. The preparations for what lay ahead took every ounce of strength we had. Supplies were gathered, weapons distributed, strategies debated. The leader of the group, a weathered man with a scar across his cheek, welcomed us, but warned of the cost. "This fight," he said, voice gravelly, "will demand everything. There's no turning back." I looked around at the faces, some unfamiliar, some now part of my new family, and knew he was right. The night before the planned attack, I found Clara standing at the edge of the camp, staring into the darkness. I joined her silently, the weight of what was to come settling over us like a shroud. "We've come so far," she said quietly. "But the hardest part is yet to come." I nodded, the past and future colliding in that moment. The man who had fled pain was now preparing to face it head-on, not just for himself, but for those who had entrusted their lives to him. As the first light of dawn touched the horizon, we steeled ourselves for the battle that would determine whether we lived as slaves to fear or as warriors of freedom. The morning air was thick with tension, the kind that settles before a storm. Our small camp was a hive of activity whispers, the clinking of weapons, and hurried footsteps across dusty ground. The sun was just rising, casting long shadows that stretched like fingers across the desert floor. I stood near the edge of the encampment, rifle in hand, watching the horizon with a mind racing through every possible outcome. It wasn't just a fight for survival anymore. It was a reckoning. Years of silence, regret, and isolation had led me here to the brink of a battle that would change everything. Clara moved through the camp with the quiet confidence of someone who had found purpose in chaos. Her wounds had healed enough to allow her to fight beside us, and despite the exhaustion etched into her features, her eyes burned with a fierce determination. She had become more than my ally, she was my strength. The women I had met as broken souls had grown into warriors, their spirits unyielding. Grace, now stronger and steadier, helped the others ready their weapons. Their faces told stories of pain but also of hope, the kind that refuses to be extinguished, no matter how dark the night. Our leader, the scarred man from the root sellers camp, gathered us together for the final briefing. His voice was low but steady, carrying the weight of experience and command. "We know where they'll come," he said, pointing to a narrow pass not far from the encampment. "It's the only route that makes sense for their horses and supply wagons. We'll set our traps there." The plan was simple but dangerous: ambush the hunters before they could reach us, use the terrain to our advantage, and disrupt their lines. We were outnumbered and outgunned, but the element of surprise and our will to fight gave us a chance. As the sun climbed higher, the first signs of the enemy appeared. Dust clouds on the horizon, the unmistakable sound of hooves pounding the earth. I felt my heart quicken, every muscle tense with readiness. When they crested the ridge, the hunters looked confident men who had never known defeat, their faces hardened by years of violence and greed. At their head rode a man whose cold eyes and gleaming badge marked him as the embodiment of everything we opposed. The air was electric as we waited for the signal. Suddenly, a sharp whistle cut through the silence, and chaos erupted. Gunfire cracked like thunder, bullets tearing through the dry air. The ambush was effective. Several horses reared and fell, and shouts of surprise echoed across the pass. The hunters scrambled to respond, but we pressed the attack, using every ounce of strength and strategy we had. I moved through the fray with a clarity I hadn't known in years. Every shot fired was a step toward redemption, every breath a defiance against the past that had nearly destroyed me. Clara fought beside me, her shotgun blazing, her presence a beacon of hope in the storm of violence. The women covered each other, their teamwork a testament to the bonds forged through suffering and survival. But the battle was brutal and unforgiving. Men fell on both sides, the ground stained with blood and dust. The hunters were relentless, their determination fueled by greed and cruelty. At one point, I found myself face to face with the man who had once sold human lives for profit, the federal marshal who had shattered so many lives, including my own. Our eyes locked, and in that moment, all the pain, anger, and loss I had carried surged to the surface. We fought not just with weapons, but with everything we were. The fight stretched on, the sun climbing to its zenith as the desert echoed with the sounds of gunfire and cries. Slowly, the tide began to turn. The hunters, caught off guard and outmatched by our determination, started to falter. When the last shot was fired, and silence fell once more, we stood victorious, but at a cost. I looked around at the faces of the women who had become my family, their strength and courage, a testament to the human spirit's capacity to endure and fight back. The scars we bore would remain, but so would the bonds forged in fire. As the dust settled and the sun dipped toward the horizon, I realized that this battle was more than just a fight for survival. It was the beginning of a new chapter, a chance to reclaim our lives, our freedom, and our dignity. And for the first time in a long time, I felt the weight of my past lift just enough to let in a glimmer of hope. The night after the battle was unlike any silence I had known before. It wasn't peaceful nor calm. It was a heavy, expectant quiet, the kind that blankets a place once the storm has passed. But before the dawn, I sat outside the small shelter we'd built on the outskirts of the encampment, the desert wind carrying the cold sting of early morning against my weathered skin. My hands trembled, not from the chill, but from the weight of everything that had happened, everything that still lay ahead. I looked over the faces around me, 6 women who had come to this place broken, hunted, and nearly defeated. Now, they stood with a fire in their eyes I had not seen in years. They weren't just survivors anymore, they were warriors. Clara was beside me, leaning against the rough wooden wall, her eyes closed as if trying to will her body to heal faster. Blood stained the edges of her dress, her wounds still raw, but her spirit was indomitable. I reached out, gently squeezing her hand, and she opened her eyes, offering a faint smile that spoke more than words ever could. We had won the battle, but the real war was far from over. The corruption that had poisoned these lands, the men like Garrett who had built their power on fear and blood, would not rest until every spark of resistance was crushed. Yet, for the first time in a long time, I believed we could ignite something larger than our Salvation movement, a light that could shatter the darkness. As dawn broke, spilling golden light across the barren valley, I knew this would be the turning point. We began gathering the wounded, tending to the broken bodies and spirits alike. Grace was among those who rallied quickly. Her fever had broken, and her laughter, soft but genuine, was a balm to us all. The others shared their stories as we worked, tales of brutality, loss, and the incredible strength it had taken just to keep moving forward. They trusted me with their truths, and in return, I shared mine, the story of Sarah, my failure, my exile, and my redemption. It was a catharsis none of us had expected. Our shared pain bound us, made us family in a way blood never could. But there was no time to rest in complacency. News came that the forces against us were regrouping, more determined than ever to hunt us down and snuff out this defiance. They had more men, more weapons, and they knew this fight threatened their grip on power. We had to move fast, and with purpose. I called a meeting, gathering every soul willing to stand and fight. The root seller and his allies had promised support, but we had to be ready to face what came with or without them. I looked into the faces of those who had become my reason to fight, the women who had trusted me with their lives and made a vow. We fight not just for ourselves, I said, voice steady but fierce, but for every person who's been silenced, who's been chained by fear and cruelty. Today, we make our stand. Plans were drawn to infiltrate the corrupt networks, to expose the shadowy deals and bring the truth to light. It would be dangerous, more dangerous than anything I'd faced before, but we had no choice. The days that followed were a whirlwind of preparation and quiet resolve. We trained relentlessly, turned every weakness into a weapon. Clara proved to be a natural leader, her compassion matched only by her unwavering resolve. Grace grew stronger, her youthful hope infectious. On the night we set out for the heart of the corruption, I felt a strange calm settle over me. The man who had once fled from pain was no more. In his place stood someone forged by fire and lost someone ready to claim his place in the world. We moved through the shadows, a small band of fighters against a seemingly invincible machine. The city that had once felt cold and indifferent now held the promise of justice. We struck hard and fast, disrupting supply lines, rescuing others trapped in the web of slavery and fear. Each victory, small but significant, fueled our hope. But the ultimate confrontation awaited the corrupt leaders, the men who'd built their empires on suffering. They had amassed their forces in a fortress, a symbol of their power and impunity. As we approached the gates, I felt the weight of history pressing down. This was more than a battle, it was a reckoning. The fight was brutal and relentless. The air was thick with smoke and gunfire, screams and shouts echoing against stone walls. We fought with everything we had. Every shot fired a blow against the darkness that had haunted us for so long. In the chaos, I found myself face to face with the man who had once been my greatest enemy, the federal marshal whose corruption had shattered so many lives. Our eyes met, and I saw in him the same fear and desperation I had once felt. But this time, I stood my ground. The struggle was fierce, a clash not just of weapons, but of wills. Every moment was a test of everything I had become. When the dust settled and the dawn broke once more, it was over. The fortress was ours. The corrupt leaders were exposed, their power broken. And for the first time, the women I had fought for and who had fought for me, truly free. As I stood among them, battered but unbroken, I realized that freedom wasn't just the absence of chains. It was the courage to face the past, to rise despite it, and to build a future worth living for. Sarah's memory no longer weighed me down. Instead, it fueled me. Clara took my hand, her smile radiant in the new sunlight. "We did it," she said softly. "No," I replied, voice thick with emotion. "We did this, together." And in that moment, I knew I had found my home not in solitude or silence, but in the bond forged through pain, hope, and unyielding courage. The dawn was no longer just the start of a new day, it was the promise of a new life. The dawn broke slow and quiet, like the world itself was holding its breath for what was to come. After everything, the pain, the loss, the battles fought with blood and bone, I knew this morning would mark the true beginning. Not just for me, but for the women who had come to this place, seeking sanctuary and found so much more. A family, a cause, a future. I stood on the ridge overlooking the valley, the wind tugging at my coat, carrying the scent of sage and sun-baked earth. The ranch below was quiet now, but not in the way it had been when I first fled into solitude years ago. It was alive with hope, with new purpose. The road here had been long and brutal, filled with memories that clawed at my soul every step of the way. Sarah's face haunted me still, a ghost that refused to be buried in the dust of the past. But today I felt her presence differently, not as a wound, but as a guide. Behind me, the women were stirring, ready to face the day, ready to rebuild the lives stolen from them. Clara, her strength never once faltering, gathered the others. Grace was teaching the youngest among us to read, her voice gentle and patient. I watched and felt a strange swell of pride, the kind I hadn't known I was capable of feeling. We had fought the darkness, yes, but the fight wasn't over, not until justice was more than just a whispered hope in the desert wind. My hands rested on the wooden fence, worn smooth by years of use. I thought back to the moment those 6 young women first appeared on my porch, faces stained with tears and dust, pleading for help. I had hesitated, nearly turning away. But something buried deep inside me had stirred a spark I thought long dead. And that spark had grown into a blaze. The men who hunted them had been relentless, shadows cast by greed and cruelty. Men who wore badges like shields but wielded cruelty like weapons. We had faced them in the open, and we had stood tall. But standing tall didn't come without sacrifice. There were moments during the fight when I thought we wouldn't see the morning. When the weight of loss pressed down so hard, I thought it might crush me. I had come to know pain like a second skin, yet even so, the fire in those women's eyes kept me going. They fought not just for themselves, but for every silent voice crushed beneath tyranny. Clara approached then, her footsteps soft but sure. She stopped beside me, her eyes catching mine. "We've come a long way," she said quietly. "We have," I replied, my voice rough with emotion. She smiled, the kind that spoke of battles won and peace earned. "And it's just the beginning," I nodded, knowing she was right. We would face many more challenges ahead, but together we were stronger than any darkness. The years I'd spent in isolation had taught me many things showed to survive. How to shut the world out, but they'd never taught me how to live. Not really. Now, with these women beside me, I was learning. Learning what it meant to trust, to hope, to love. That afternoon, we gathered beneath the old oak tree by the creek, the place where the desert met the sky and the world felt vast and endless. We shared stories, laughter, and tears. The wounds, both seen and unseen, still ached, but they were no longer chains, they were reminders of how far we'd come. Grace pulled a worn book from her satchel and began reading aloud, her voice steady and clear. The others listened, some closing their eyes, letting the words wash over them like a balm. I looked around at their faces, scarred, beautiful, And I knew that no matter what the future held, we had found something that could never be taken from us. Freedom, forged in fire and bound by unbreakable bonds. Later, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of crimson and gold, Clara and I stood alone by the fire. She reached out, her hand finding mine. "Are you ready?" she asked softly. I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of years lift with the coming night. "I am." We had survived the worst the world could throw at us. We had fought monsters with badges and broken chains forged in pain. Now, it was time to live. To build a life not defined by fear, but by hope. As the stars ignited the night sky, I felt a peace I hadn't known since before the darkness. Sarah's memory was no longer a burden, but a light guiding me forward. And in that moment, I understood the truth I'd been running from for so long. Redemption wasn't just about saving others, it was about saving yourself. Together, we would rise from the ashes of our pasts, stronger and freer than ever before. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in my life, I was ready to walk it. Not alone, but with the family I had found in the desert, the 6 fierce souls who had reminded me what it meant to be alive. The sun had set on the old me, and with the dawn, a new life began. If you were in their shoes, would you fight the same battle? Share your thoughts with us in the comments below, and don't forget to like the video. Explore the other videos on the screen, now you never know which story will move you next.